And first up, I would like to invite Ndogozo to please come up because she's brought this wonderful climate clock, which she's going to present to the Prime Minister here. Would you like to say a few words about it before? Please come.
Hi guys, how are you doing? Firstly, thank you very much to the Honorable Prime Minister for inviting us. There's nothing that is exciting as seeing leaders who take issues of climate change seriously, who push for change, who engage with the youth in a meaningful way, and who even invite us to these stages. So we're really honored to be here. So I am Dogozo Muloi from Climate Clock. Climate Clock is this beautiful tool. This is the portable version, but there's like monuments all around the world. So when the IPCC data came out and said that it's code red for humanity and we have less than 7 years to act, that scared us because when we looked at policies, all the policies were saying Agenda 2050, 2070, 20 whatever, and that didn't actually speak to the urgency with which we needed to act for climate change. I myself, I'm from Durban, KwaZulu Natal in South Africa, and I've experienced loss and damage. Just this year we had floods and landslides, and I lost family members. Two of my family members died, and we lost infrastructure in just 2 days. We lost infrastructure worth 100 billion, and this is the same for the SIDS. So with the SIDS, your Bahamas and other places in the Caribbean, that's what they're experiencing, and we want to adapt, and we are happy that we have leaders that are pushing for for a loss and damage finance facility. And we've done research to track how much money is owed in loss and damage. And yeah, it's on our website. You can go there. I'm like rushing because of time. But Prime Minister, we would love to give this to you. And we would love for you to use it. And when we ask for the billions, remind them that we could be asking for more. But, but we only want billions.
Well done. Thank you so much for coming and sharing that with us this morning. And I'm going to hand directly over now to Stephen, who's from PwC, who have enabled us to make the Extreme Hangout possible this year. So we're incredibly grateful to them. I'll let you take it away, Stephen. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm keen to get started. And actually, thank you for those very fantastic words. I almost don't need to give an introduction to the panel now. You've nailed it in terms of what we're here for, and what we're trying to do. We've seen many speeches over the last couple of days. And clearly, we're not where we need to be. Around about 15% a year. Last year, we only hit 0.5%. In order to be able to keep that to sort of 1.5 degrees. Now, the next generation understands this very well, and I guess it's pretty clear there's been a collective failure in parts of my generations and generations that have gone before, and the evidence is clear that we need to ensure that we have a stronger voice at the table from a youth perspective. Indeed, it's probably the main voice we need, not just come to the table, be the table, run the table, make that happen. And I guess in terms of this particular panel, I really want to get behind that question. How do we really enable the environment in such a way that we have the right voice at that table? And I want to really understand how we drive that and come out of this with some solid ideas. We've got around 40 minutes of sort of Q&A, and the Prime Minister, I think, needs to leave at 10:30, so we'll try and allow for that, and then we'll focus around it. Sure. Just in terms of, thank you. Just in terms of quick introduction. So obviously we're joined by the Prime Minister Philip Davis, who's the Prime Minister of the Bahamas. a country that's obviously on the front line of climate change. What many might not know is that the Prime Minister entered politics late, so he's actually a very well-known local and international corporate and human rights lawyer, highly distinguished legal educator, and a passionate sportsman. So a bit more background on the Prime Minister. I'm also joined next to me by Rosalind Skillen. So Rosalind is a climate activist and campaigner, studied her Master's in Environmental Policy in Dublin, and alongside her studies, Rosalind works for the environmental charity Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful, and she's also a columnist at the Belfast Telegraph. So welcome, Rosalind. Also joined by Nasha Kuvelier. She's an environmental scientist, climate change specialist, had a degree in environmental sciences and a specialist in climate change, co-founder of SSF, more than 10 years of activism and project management related to mitigation, adaptation and awareness. Back in 2015, she was chosen as one of the 2 UNESCO Youth Global Delegates at the Paris Agreement. So welcome, Nasha. Also joined by Bradley Watson. Bradley is an environmental scientist investigating nature-based solutions to global climate change. He holds a master's degree in biology and sustainable development, and his goals is to identify opportunities in natural ecosystems that will allow us to actualize climate adaptation strategies by developing appropriate solutions in the context of international and local policy frameworks. So Bradley, welcome. And finally, Tarek, fellow panelist from the Middle East, is a co-founder of 3BL Associates, so co-founder of an ecosystem of social and planetary systems enterprises with impact in over 90 countries, including 3BL Associates, Diversity on Board, Recipes for Wellness, and Public Planet Partnerships. Tarek's from the state of Bahrain. So just welcome my panelists, please. So maybe I will kick off with the Prime Minister, and maybe we'll have a conversation about whether I should start with the Prime Minister in the context of giving youth a voice, but we'll start with the Prime Minister. So 3/4 of those under 30 believe that business and political leaders have messed up. How can people in positions of power rebuild trust between generations and allow for meaningful cooperation on the climate crisis? Prime Minister.
One word: engage them, and continue to engage them. For my part, I do appreciate it that our voices are old and tired. And unless we do have and cultivate the sensitivity in our young about their surroundings and the environment, it'll all be lost. Because our generation, many of us have just given up, who have some concern about it. I have not, and I will not give up. And I try to emphasize that to a lot of my peers, but at the same time encourage them to bring along the young people. So, for example, we have exposed 2 college students from our University of Bahamas, high school students. We brought them over so they can start from this age to understand what's happening, what we are doing or not doing, and to lend their voice to action. Because for far too long, all we've been doing is talking. This is the 27th Conference of the Parties, designed for the purpose of talking about the protection of our environment. And what do we have after 27 years? More flooding, mudslides, more hurricanes with great intensity. As we speak, as we sit here, we from the Bahamas, worrying about what's happening now as a result of Hurricane Nicole that is passing through our islands as I speak now. And the only way, we talk about the 1.5 we should keep alive. But I've said to them, that ambition is on life support. I don't think we'll be able to achieve it. So what happens next? That's why it's so important for you who are going to inherit what we leave behind, understand what that inheritance is all about, and ensure that it has value and worth to you. And without a a world that that reverses the loss of biodiversity, right? That reverses the trend of and reduces the carbon footprint. What will you be inheriting? And so it is important to let's engage the youth. It's not going to be easy to win their trust, but I think with the young being involved and being exposed to what we are doing at this level, it will assist in building that trust that's necessary.
Wonderful. Thank you, Prime Minister. I just want to explore, so getting youth more involved, and I'm going to come to Rosalind initially, because there's always a danger that we pay lip service. We have various things that happen that bring youth into the debate, but is it substantive? And what do you think we could be doing to ensure that we get young climate activists more engaged, more involved, and that influence actually has an impact? What would be your perspective on that, Noel?
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I think for me, it's not just a question of getting young people into the room or giving them a seat at the table, but it's about actually giving them like the skills development, the training and the capacity building so that they can be effective when they're there. Because I think so often the focus is on getting young people into these spaces, but they haven't actually been given the negotiation skills or the capacity building to really meaningfully contribute, and then that means that maybe they feel imposter syndrome or they feel like they can't contribute in the way that they'd like to. So an example would be the Youth Negotiator Programme, which has been operating for the first time this year. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with it, but where they're training, I think it's like 27 27 negotiators from young negotiators from 27 different countries, and they're trying to get that figure up to 50. And these people, young people, are going to be sitting as part of the official delegates in their own countries as youth negotiators, and I think that's really powerful because then they're able to sort of have that like intergenerational dialogue, share knowledge, expertise, and I think spaces which enable dialogue are really important. Like even a lot of the time, if young people come forward with policy proposals or recommendations, some of the time there's not even like feedback, whether that be negative feedback or constructive criticism. I think it's really important that there's a conversation and some sort of level of reciprocity. And then finally, the point which I want to raise, which is sometimes like a bit of the elephant in the room, that as well, because a lot of the youth opportunities are voluntary, and that really excludes a lot of people. I mean,
education, skills, etc. I'm just going to come to Bradley, just to feel like, because I guess, is there more? And apologies, Prime Minister, but the average age for a sort of state leader is around about 62. No comments. The average age of people around the world is 30. What is your perspective, Bradley, on what more we could be doing in terms of just the way politics works and engagement that can address that seeming balance?
I think that when you think about politics, oftentimes governments represent their populations, but they also represent corporations, right? So how does a corporation operate? A corporation delegates responsibility for assets to qualified individuals and gives them the agency to make decisions and then follow through, right? So what if a government were to operate the same way? Delegate responsibility for assets to young people. You know, if there's a national park, why not give a group of young people who are talented, motivated, and skilled the authority to come to COP and negotiate on behalf of that asset? You know, that would facilitate change, and it would allow us to make change much more rapidly, because a lot of things are happening on the ground at rapid fire. And I think that it would actually make COP even more useful, because we have this consideration that, you know, we keep coming to these events and keep trying to make things happen, but it doesn't happen. And so, yes, we need to operate in the negotiation space, but when we're talking about getting funding for to implement any sort of change that we want to make, we don't have the authority to say, you know, we can make that change. So as soon as we can delegate that responsibility to a capable and responsible group of young people, they might be able to close the deals more rapidly. And that's a risk. You know, it's a high risk for a government to take, to say we're going to put that sort of trust in a young person. But as the Prime Minister mentioned, it's about building trust. The governments are looking to build trust with us young people, and we're looking to get the trust of governments because, you know, we think we know better, and I think we might, because we just finished reading the book.
You undoubtedly will know better. Let's move beyond think I know better, and let's get to we know better. So, phenomenal perspective there on both capacity building and then getting into actually some political. How do we restructure things in terms of actual voice at the table? Nash, I want to come to you next on just to build a little bit on that. Obviously, the next generations, what we're finding is actually if you like, the psychological effects of what could be coming is increasingly having an impact. I know in our research, when we talk, we do a hopes and fears survey around the world on what young people are thinking and the level of stress around some of these things, uncertainty obviously around financial future, but stress and psychological impact of where's the world going. What sort of impacts is that having on the next generation, and how could that sort of hold us back as well?
Well, myself, I have experienced eco-anxiety. I believe that all of us have felt eco-anxiety. I've been a climate activist for 10 years, so every year gets worse. So it's very difficult to get like some good news somehow, sometimes. And that led me in sort of spiritual research. And I'm going to speak from heart, because we need to train our minds, but we need to train our hearts. But it's going to be difficult times ahead. And in my case, I have found that we need leaders, a generation of leaders that can be a light in the dark, that can be calm during the storm, that can be really loving in very violent times. If you can train that as a human being, as a good human in this earth, then you can have a good generation of leaders for the times to come. And to do that, you need to work with communities. You need to go picking treasure in the sea. You need to go planting trees. You need to go doing community activities. And that helps us build the sense of being together in this action. And that's what we do with our organization. And I think many youth-led organizations are taking really bold steps in their territories with their communities. And we need to empower them, not only with skills and the opportunity to speak and to have moments to foster their work, but also with finance. We need to give grants to youth-led organizations because they are doing a great job and they need it.
Perfect. Very, very good. Thank you. And just to build on that with Tarek, and I want to get round everyone, and we'll get some responses and get the conversation going. I guess a big part of what could be helpful going forward is technology, and obviously with that's not going to rest with me and the Prime Minister, with all due respect, around the opportunities with technology, the opportunities through social media, the opportunities of technology. Maybe your perspective, Tarek, on how can that act as an asset around climate change?
First of all, thank you, Stephen and Honourable Prime Minister. I'll answer that question in the context of what's already been shared. I think starting in the context of trust, because young people indeed have a lack of trust in our global political system, in institutions, institutionalism, but there's actually one aspect of mistrust which I find is positive. Globally, there is a growing mistrust from young people in the system of capitalism. In every single country, and surveyed with young people by Edelman, they believe that capitalism does more harm than good. And actually, I think there is a mandate that's actually there to say that the type of rapid transformation we require has a very strong mandate and a powerful mandate from young people. But the question of technology then comes, because capitalism doesn't innovate, people do. Capitalism tends to appropriate and extract from communities, from systems, and I think technology can be an incredibly powerful tool as long as it's done in a system that is regenerative, that's centered on well-being economies, that doesn't lead to more debt extraction from small island states in particular. And I think we need to be very clear around the social and political innovations that surround how we use technology. Of course, as young people, we're technology natives, but also it needs to be in a context of for me, a more post-growth and well-being centered economy that enables technology to be really leveraged in a way that it's meant to.
Clear. So let's unpick and sort of get into a bit more around that. I'm keen to sort of think about that intergenerational dialogue. And maybe I'll start, Prime Minister, just maybe your reaction to the panel and their comments so far, and then what do you think needs to be done to foster ever stronger sort of intergenerational dialogue?
Well, what I'm hearing here is, I think, is being repeated in different ways. But the bottom line is that empowering our youth to be able to take meaningful steps to assist in the argument for action on the part of leaders and the industrialized world, including the huge emitting oil-producing companies, etc., which comes out of, I think that bleeds into the issue of capitalism, because one of the things I spoke about yesterday is there's this need to increase profit and preserve profit at the expense of the environment. One of the outcomes we're hoping, as part of the issues that we're going to have in the negotiations going forward, is a tax, some sort of taxing of profits of the huge multinational oil producers. We're suggesting from the Caribbean, we're suggesting a 2% tax on oil exports to go into a fund to assist with loss and damage. And again, the cynicism surrounding loss and damage, which we've been talking about for over 30 years, and for the first time, it's going to be an item on the agenda specifically, but it excludes the very essence of the conversation, and that is liability. That is the liability that results as a consequence. Who will be paying for losses we incur? And so the suggestion that perhaps a rethink of capitalism, a redefinition of capitalism to ensure that there's what I call an element of the common good, as opposed to the emphasis on profit at any cost, should be a part of the conversation going forward. In the Western world, when you start talking with, if you start talking about dismantling capitalism, the voices of the capitalists will be rearing their head, and then you'll be called the socialist, and that becomes part of the political conversation. And we know what some socialist countries and communist countries have produced a lot of refugees as a result. And so it's very interesting what's happening right now today in America with the midterm elections, and some, the fear of one party being a socialist party, and democracy is really it's the geopolitical issues just compound the complexity of the question. But I think if we simplify it all, what is needed is a sense of what the common good is, having everyone buying into the common good. And I think if we understand that we are all our brother's keepers, and that we could only be kept if the world is a livable place. And it's not livable if we continue to have the mudslides, the wildfires, the hurricanes. It's not a livable place. And so I think that is where the conversation needs to continue being carried on. I think it's, again, the voice of the young has to be a very important part of it. I recognize that. And so for this year alone, We had a youth, 1 year we did something with the University of Bahamas in January. Then we had, which was regional, the youth, and then we had another in July, sponsored by my government. And so, yes, we need to be able to fund events such as that and understand that the investment in creating young climate activists could only inure for our benefit, because at the end of the day, we could leave for the generation behind us a world that they could live in, and I call it a livable world.
Perfect. Right. I want to sort of maybe because it's I guess one of the things about this COP is that loss and damage is part of the conversation, and maybe I'll go there in terms of having a bit more.
But it's the most important element of it.
That's
liability.
Right. That's right. That's right. But I'm keen to get a different generational view on loss and damage, and maybe just as a sort of conversation with our four panelists. I don't know who would like to go first. Just on what would be what's a sort of perspective on loss and damage?
Well, the fact that the loss and damage is first time officially in the agenda is a very good first step, but it's the first step. You need the second and the third and the fourth, right? You need the facility, you need to measure, you need everything. And we organize also the Regional Conference of Youth, but for Latin America in September in Cartago, in Costa Rica. And one of the outcomes was to have a regional observatory of loss and damages. Not only lives, species, infrastructure, but also cultural losses. When a community cannot fish anymore, the fish that used to be there and the women do not gather in the same kitchen to have the same conversations and speak their language and cook together and make something for the community, then you have a cultural loss that is almost impossible to measure. Like, as you said before, language too. Languages that are being lost. So we need to measure our losses, even if it is almost impossible to put a price on a human life, but we need to have some sense of measure, or at least to have a document information. Right now, on the loss and damages is because you saw a newspaper and some journalists. But if there is no journalist there to tell the story of what is happening, then there is no record. So we need to advance this as a region, and I think it could help in the conversation of having a loss and damage facility too.
Ready.
Just to add on to that, we were at the youth pavilion yesterday, and a young man from Pakistan came up, and he was from an indigenous group, and he was describing his experience of loss and damages, and he was saying to us, standing there, fluent English, saying that he lost his mother due to the climate change impacts in Pakistan. And looking at that man speak to us, I had to take into account, how did he get here? How did he travel to that spot? How did he learn to speak English so well? How did he learn to be a public speaker and get the entire crowd to listen to him and understand what he's trying to say? And for all those things to come together, for him to come and deliver that message, it made me realize, all right, so there was a community that didn't have somebody like him to come and represent them. Or there was a community that had somebody like him who couldn't afford to send them. Or maybe that person wasn't able to speak English and bring that message. And so like you say, if there's no representation, and if there's no way for us to measure these losses and damages and represent them on a world scale, to add on to that, every day I meet somebody new who has a loss and damage. And so the picture of it all is not just limited to a small island state or a developing country, because there are individuals. I met somebody from Louisiana, and we were having a conversation about loss and damage, and then we realized, the state of Louisiana needs to sue their own government for loss and damages due to climate change impacts, but their government is not allocating resources to respond to that. And then we had conversations about internal migration. You were talking about when you have somebody who has to leave their community and go and live near to a city in, impromptu housing, looking for work. Those individuals are put in a vulnerable state, and they're more prone to engage in risky behaviors. That's perilous for our world, and we're losing resources, human resources, every day. We're losing souls. So it's a very complex and a very grand issue. Yeah.
And Tariq, in a country that's pretty much under threat in terms of rising sea levels in Bahrain, your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, just to also build on your point, I think any young person who's lived through a heat wave or a hurricane doesn't go through PTSD. It is continuous traumatic stress disorder. It is something which is so deeply ingrained, and of course we know that people who are burnt out because of that can't save a burning planet, and there's a psychological element around loss and damage and cultural element indeed that is so hard to quantify. But one thing that we can quantify is, as an islander, we know that there is a nexus around climate impacts and death, which impacts us. And I think it goes to your earlier question around how do we engage young people meaningfully in the system. And we do have a global power gap when it comes to young people having the power across multiple mechanisms and institutional forms of engaging in the system. But the most quantifiable aspect and manifestation of power is money. And as a small island state, we know that between 2016 to 2020, small islands only received $1.5 billion in climate financing, whereas what we've paid to external creditors is over 25 billion. Now that's over 18 times as much. Now that's today, and you can imagine the debt burden increasing for young people, and actually the power gap from those from small island states, 65 million people around the world who are going to be more indebted, who are going to be subject to more neo-colonial forms of extraction. And that's an aspect of loss and damage, I think, today, where we don't want to be perpetuating the deep inequalities that led us to this crisis in the first place, and also giving young people even a chance to participate and step into their power in this current system.
And maybe, Rosalind, coming from the Western world, and just interested in from your perspective, let's get a complete picture on that thought perspective on loss and damage.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think it's really important to recognise, coming from Ireland, my role is entirely different, because a lot of the time the conversation about loss and damage is about global solidarity, justice and compassion. So the way I see it is trying to open people up in Ireland about why this is important. A lot of people are unfamiliar with the term, and a lot of the campaigning and advocacy that we've been doing as young people in Ireland before coming to COP27 is bringing this to the table. We met with the Taoiseach, the head of state, yesterday to talk about loss and damage, and typically it's a really sad reality, but there's this idea that people don't need to look beyond their own backyards, particularly in Western nations, and it's really important to push beyond this narrative. And I think the media has a massive role to play in that. To be honest, last year, COP26 in Glasgow, there was a lot more media attention from UK and Irish media, and that was largely because Glasgow was the host country, obviously, but it was also to do with the fact that decarbonisation was big on the agenda, and this year loss and damage is not as appealing to Western nations, but it's a fact that they need to step up and deliver. So I've been sort of engaging with different radios and different MPs, and the pushback that you get is unbelievable in terms of people saying loss and damage is a distraction. It's really sad. But it's really big. It means that the role of young people in Western nations is to step up and talk about it and explain why it is important, and why we should be talking about it, even if a country like Ireland, who's not feeling the most devastating consequences of the climate crisis yet, it's so important that we remember that the climate crisis then isn't something for the future. It's something which is happening now, and it's making people's realities and lives unlivable. So I guess a lot of it is about educating people who are maybe unfamiliar with this topic and explaining why it's important and how it ties to social justice, human rights, and all those other critical social issues.
You might add just
Please, yeah, go for it.
You started talking about Glasgow, and it made me remember this story. So in the UK, you had Scotland, and there was a time when the clearances happened, right? And so they cleared people out of the Highlands so that they can farm sheep. And a lot of those people moved to Glasgow. And so that brought on this thing called the Glasgow effect. And so if you were to control for income, age, gender, somebody living in Glasgow just has a shorter lifespan. And so you ask yourself, why? Why is that the case? And it's because those people were moved from their cultural heritage and put in a place that they did not want to be. And so if you were to relate that story to somebody in the Western world and you say, listen, think about it, it's happened in your own country. It's not a different situation. If you take somebody from where they belong and put them somewhere they didn't want to go, it's going to have a negative impact. And there's evidence for that. and it's with a group that they can identify with. So, you know, that might be a tool you can use when you go to speak to people. Yeah.
Perfect, brilliant. I want to just kind of conscious the Prime Minister's going to have to leave in a moment, so I'm keen to get your sort of final perspectives on what you've heard here and I guess hopes for the future.
Yeah, I think one of the why loss and damage is a topical conversation that should be embraced by the youth. It has, because it is about compensation, and compensation in a way that it is not why compensation. It's because start from the Bahamas. If you profile our debt, the debt of the Bahamas, you'll find that more than 40% of our debt is directly attributable to reconstruction and recovery from the consequences of climate change. We incur that debt because we have to borrow monies to reconstruct and for recovery. Now, every time a hurricane comes, right, we have to borrow to reconstruct and recover. So that is debt that's being left behind for you behind us to pay. What we are saying is that the time has come for the polluters to compensate us, so that we could stop borrowing, so we could deal with those issues of what government truly needs to be doing with their resources. You know, providing good health care, clean water, you know, achieving our SDG goals where resources are clearly needed, as opposed to a hurricane comes and we now need to spend those resources on recovery and reconstruction. And again, the multinational and the banks just piling more debt onto our small island countries. And what is more, the access to funding is the criteria to be able to get it for small island developing states has to be revisited as well, because they have these protocols of, well, you're a graduated state because your GDP is such that you are not entitled to get grants and or concessionary loans, and even those those numbers are skewed. We have to look at it because debt sustainability ratios has to be rethought of. I've been meeting with the IMF. We had a strong meeting with them this week, and there has to be, and they've undertaken to relook at how they treat and assess our debts in respect to debt sustainability. And so, in closing for me, we need to continue to engage young people, get onto your governments, and make a difference. And just don't sit back and wait for them to do anything. You take it upon yourself and understand that this world belongs to you. And when you grow up, you want to be able to live in the world in a comfortable, what I call a comfortable zone, where you're able to enjoy what I call the natural joys of life, to which we all have that right, the entitlement to what I call the natural joys of life, to be able to live, have a loving family, be able to grow your children up, have the joys of seeing them graduated from high school, and to see them they prosper in life. And that's just not to have the short-term view, well, I am now enjoying myself and forgetting what's behind. Always live on the pretext that what I do, I should be doing it to ensure that the common good is not adversely affected by my act and conduct. And so young people, continue. For my part, I'll continue to, well, being among the young makes me young, or at least feel young. And so you'll have me amongst you all the time. So I wish to thank you all for having me. Just being here is sufficient for me that I have to speak. I'm here to listen because I'm more inclined to act than to speak or talk. And I want to thank you all.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Maybe we'll continue in about 2-3 minutes. We'll let the Prime Minister leave. Okay, we will continue. Thanks again to the Prime Minister for his insight. And we were just having a short sort of off-site conversation. I just want to move the conversation specifically into this intergenerational voice. And actually, as I was talking and thinking about things, this, I guess, loss and damage is kind of an intergenerational point as well, in terms of what's the loss and damage that's been inflicted by generations to generations. And using that as a sort of prompt, just some, I guess I'm looking for some concrete ideas in the sort of political discourse as to exactly how we can drive a stronger voice from an intergenerational perspective. And maybe, I don't know who wants to take that first, Bradley? Yep.
So this idea, when you were talking about it being an intergenerational challenge, and this debt crisis being an intergenerational challenge, right? You think back to the caste system in India, right? When somebody is, born into a caste and is burdened with the debt of their parents, and that debt limits their progress in society and their ability to adapt to life around them and to take advantage of the opportunities that they're entitled to as humans. That's what we're doing to countries every single day. If you are in debt for a hurricane that happened 20 years before you were even born, and now that debt is sitting on your country's balance sheet and limiting your access to financing to make any changes for the future that are going to make your life better. It's, okay, we have an accounting system, we have a financial system where people have to be held accountable and there needs to be responsibility. That's the only way it's going to work. But it's also just simply unfair to burden people with debts that they did not incur themselves. To move on to thinking about how to empower youth. I know you were saying that there are 27 countries represented in this youth negotiator group. And I just wanted to point out that these young people came from the Bahamas so that they could get a head start, basically. It doesn't make any sense for us to learn the same lesson again and again. You don't need to have somebody find their way into the system and figure it out and fumble around, and then next year somebody else has to do that. So our goal is to guide them through so that when it's their time to step up to the plate, they're doing it better than we are.
So I think we need kind of a really collective brainstorming about how we deal with loss and damages. Of course, we need money, but that's for compensation, right? How do we face next loss and damages? And to share best practices, how do we manage migrants? How do we manage agricultural losses? How do we manage the lack of safe water? How do we manage food insecurity? How do we manage gender perspectives? Because when you migrate and you are a young woman, you are far more vulnerable to harassment than other communities. So how do we manage all of this? And if we start taking steps, it's going to be easier to manage than if we wait to the storm to really harass everything and have other people coming, and that's going to be far worse. So I think that talking about some good practices is a good thing. And I can share one. I think that I live in a rural area, actually. I live 100 kilometers at the north of Buenos Aires. And we need to understand how we manage monocultures to agroecology. But one thing is that you have a monoculture and you have a drought. How do you pronounce drought? Drought. And you may lose all of your crops. But if you do agriculture and you have many crops, different crops, and you manage your biodiversity in insects and everything, you may lose one of all of your pots, but not all of them. So you have more food security. And that's something we're trying to speak with producers to try to change their mind about monocultures. That's just one thing to share.
Yeah, thank you. I think to build on those comments as well as those of the Honourable Prime Minister, it's clear that debt is an environmental issue, and possibly the most effective youth policies we can act is debt cancellation, global reparations, and also non-debt-based finance. And it's not something you'd often hear from what a youth policy is or what an environmental issue is, but I think that kind of goes to the core And I think building on kind of your point of what is more concrete, what I see is why we're in the situation that we're in this intergenerational disparity, is because we are not actually taking a rights-based approach to climate action. Now, of course, within the negotiations, there's been a very large push by business and civil society groups to take rights-based frameworks around adaptation, mitigation, and others. And for me, that's why young people are also being left behind, because once we take a rights-based approach to financing, to mitigation, to adaptation, actually that opens up the door for bringing young people to the seats of power at the table. That opens the door for improved labor standards, wage standards, actually looking at a global suite of policies that put youth, indigenous communities, and the most vulnerable at the center. So I think when often you'll hear as well during negotiations of it's important to take a rights-based approach, actually that is the framework and those are the conditions in which young people can actually thrive, and why for me that's not the case at the moment.
Tara, just before I come to Rosalind, I'm just going to put the audience on warning. So I'm looking for a couple of questions. Just we'll wrap up after a couple of questions from the audience. I'm particularly looking at my Bahamian students to be thinking of a particularly challenging question for the audience. So I'll come back to you guys in a moment. Rosalind, just your perspective.
Yeah, when Tarek was saying there about rights-based approaches, it made me think, I don't know how familiar people are with the Future Generations Commissioner in Wales, and that idea that there's like a designated person who sits outside government independent, but someone who vouches for how any new law or regulation is going to impact future generations. And I just think that's really, really cool, and it should be enshrined in more countries. That issue of intergenerational justice. But I guess when I was thinking about intergenerational dialogue, I think it's about mainstreaming youth voice. Some of my favourite events that I participate in are not necessarily like youth events where like there's one young person on the panel, but it's just like mainstreamed and just part of the conversation. And I think that's kind of the direction that we need to go. And I think then that often I want to always like caveat myself, because I don't really like pitting too much generations against each other, because I think often youth climate activists and the media sometimes are complicit in this, pit like young people against old people. Young climate activists are often told or asked if they hate old people, which isn't the case. Some of my environmental heroes are like from like 60 plus. But I do think that the ways that different generations create change also opens conditions for like skills development and knowledge sharing. And for example, I work with a lot of older people in community gardens, and you literally don't see anyone under 60. Like I lower the demographic significantly just by being there. And then if you go to a climate strike, everyone is maybe like under 25. So I'm always trying to get more older people at climate strikes and more younger people in community gardens and allotments. And I think that's a really nice way of creating like intergenerational dialogue, learning, and also like intergenerational action as well.
So also, I think that it's important that we do not put so much pressure in youth as a generation to make the changes that need to be, that we need to see. Because young people right now do not have the power to change, because they are not politicians, they are not millionaires, they are not, because they are young, and that's good. There are few really stars, young stars, but mainly, as you say, the average world is 30, but that generation is not yet in the power. So we need to understand that in the framework of time that we need the change, all the generations alive today need to change. Not only young people, we need to wait them to be in power. We need to change like now. So everyone, even my mom and my grandma, they need to rethink how they buy, how they eat, how they move, where do they go to vacations, what are their jobs, where do they invest if they have some pocket money in their houses. Everything needs to change in each generation.
Very clear. Do I have any volunteers for a quick question? Yes, yeah? Well, there's a gentleman at the back would like to. Can we get a mic?
Thank you. I'm wondering from the panelists, there was some talk of rights-based approaches, which I think is useful. I'm wondering where you think of sort of ecocentric perspectives in that sort of rights-based framework. many of the indigenous communities that you guys refer to deeply believe that the set of relations that we have with the earth should be different. Would it help if we gave rights to nature? How do you feel about that sort of thinking?
I think rights of nature is really, really important, and I'm really happy to say that in Ireland, some local councils have already adopted a rights of nature approach. Friends of the Earth in Ireland are doing incredible work on this, and people who are looking at rivers and areas of peatland, for example, areas of the countryside where they've put in like a wind turbine without consultation on biodiversity and stuff. So I think that we really need to enshrine a rights of nature approach, and I think that moving away from like that human-centric approach is definitely part of the conversation with young people as well. So yeah, I think it's like imperative.
So in Latin America, you have 3 countries that actually recognize nature as a legal status. So you have Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile right now with all the changes that have happened in Chile. And that's it's also a good first step for non-indigenous communities, like more like Western ideological countries, to recognize nature with a legal status. Because then you can have some litigations regarding nature damages or ecocide or whatever the terms you want to use. But we need to recognize them as a subject of legal status.
Yeah, I love that question. It's one I also work on. I run a platform that looks at interspecies collaborations, and we look at what the rights-based approach look like for human and more than human communities. And I think there's a traditional method or way, which is we assign rights to a river, a mountain, an insect, and individualize, compartmentalize aspects of nature. I think that's how the movement really had started. And I feel now the more powerful way is to go back to actually how indigenous communities have looked at it for thousands of years, which is it's not about giving an individual river a right. Actually, it's about the relationship that river has to the people living on the land, to the fish, to the algae. And for me, a just transitions and rights-based approach takes a relational approach. It's not about splitting up and compartmentalizing nature and separating us, of course, from nature, but actually looking at a whole system and whole ecosystems approach. And I find that's where nature-based solutions today often get a rights-based approach wrong, because there is a separation. There is an aspect around, right, we have a nature-based solution, but actually forgetting who is managing that nature-based solution, which is often indigenous peoples. And I find that a way to really ensure a rights-based approach is one that is planet-centric and that is more than human-centric as well. And I think we can't get to a rights-based approach unless that is the case.
Sorry. Also, I think that it's important to spend time in pristine nature. When we come to, like, I don't know, this is grass, but this is not natural. I mean, it's not, it was not here before humans, right? So if you spend time in pristine nature, you understand the logic, and you start to see where the water comes from, where the energy comes from, what are the relationship between species. And when you understand that logic, then it's difficult to come back. It's when your conscience expands, it cannot come back to the normal size. So I think that spending time in pristine nature, trekking, or just visiting in a very lovely way, not with, you know, motorbikes and destroying nature, no, just being really immersed in pristine nature really helps people to get that sense of being the same.
Okay, yeah.
There are more questions. You know, I'm in tune with the ideas about rights for nature. I come from the background is ecology, and so, you know, thinking about ecosystem services and how systems interact, right? And one thing that always comes to mind is that we never actually quantify everything that an ecosystem gives us. There will always be something else left out. And so if we're trying to make our decisions based on the value of an ecosystem, and we're always going to underestimate that value, then, you know, I think that that's not necessarily the best way to go. So thinking about it as a rights-based approach does seem more appropriate. But then you brought forth the idea of pristine nature. And there's there's a thought out there in the world of ecology that there's no such thing as pristine nature left. That it just, and we're always manipulating environments, oftentimes to suit our needs. So when we think about polyculture, like you were mentioning, right? You know, why do we do a polyculture, and then how do we choose which plants to put in the polyculture? We choose the plants that serve us, and only recently have we decided that pollinators matter, right? So we care about bees now. We only just began this. And we decide now that in our polycultures we should include flowering plants to support the bees. But these are all human decisions. You know, if we really think about it, what is nature and what are we protecting? And then if we're doing all this protection to develop ecosystem services to keep ourselves alive, and then we go back and say that it's about rights for nature, what are we doing? You know? It's just, it's a wicked problem. It's really confusing, yeah.
Well, listen, guys, I think we're going to be running short on time. I'd like to. You just opened up a whole different debate that I'd love to get into. So I feel really bad about what is nature after all, and we're quite sure where we could get to with that one. But I just want to, I guess, first thing, just a massive thank you to Rosalind, Bradley, Nasha, and to Tarek, and maybe a big round of applause, please. Really a humbling experience to spend time with you guys on this topic. I hope people took away some good learnings. I've taken plenty of good learnings there around what some of the opportunities are, both from yourselves and from the Prime Minister, on some of that intergenerational challenge. I wish you a good COP, the rest of it. Keep making the impact that you're making. It's obviously making a difference. And thank you to everyone for joining online and joining here in this beautiful location. Thank you.